County archivist. So today we're going to be having a instructional session on the Lantern Project, which is a federally funded grant project that the Montgomery County Archives, a division of probate court, has taken part in over the last 3 years. So just a couple of housekeeping points before we get into it. You'll notice that the slideshow on your screen reads Mississippi State University, and you'll see that on every slide. That's because Mississippi State University was the grant project lead, and so they developed the instructional packet that I'll be working from today, which is why you see Mississippi State University on the slides. The first portion of the instructional session will be a PowerPoint overview of the grant as well as the resulting database that we've created as part of the grant. At any point that you have questions, please interject. We have someone monitoring the live stream as well, so please type your questions as you want to. Let's see here, and then the second half of today's workshop will be a hands-on session where we will play with the Lantern Project database a little bit, just so that you can get some familiarity with that. Another thing you'll notice on some of these slides is that they're very text heavy, which I'll apologize for in advance. I didn't write the slides, so I'll summarize. There's no need to read every last word, but we wanted to include more information than less. Lastly, the subject matter that we're discussing today is very sensitive, and I'm aware of that and cognizant of that fact. So if you need to step away for a minute, just collect yourself. That's certainly understandable, and I encourage you to do so if you need to. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. All right. So we need to know what the Lantern Project is. So essentially, it's a federally funded grant through the National Archives where we received $342,000 spread among 6 partner institutions. So that includes Mississippi State University, the University of Mississippi, Delta State University, Historic Natchez Foundation, the Columbus Lowndes Public Library in Mississippi, and us. Who stands out there? The Montgomery County Archives. You'll see that the list of partners is heavily weighted in favor of Mississippi institutions. So how this project came about is in 2018, I met Jennifer McGillen of Mississippi State University at an archives conference here in Montgomery, where I presented on local slave records, and she was doing that sort of work in Mississippi. And so we being the Montgomery County Archives, were able to piggyback on her proposed grant project. So the Lantern Project, what we've been doing over the past 3 years is going through our respective collections, looking for records, specifically local legal records and some manuscript records, non-government records, that mention enslaved people. So you may or may not know that in the Southeast, local government was intimately connected with slavery. And accordingly, local legal records frequently mention enslaved people. And the general public, and knowledge is increasing, but many folks do not know that these records exist in their communities. And so that was our goal with the Lantern Project, was to locate these records and bring awareness to these records, and then make them available on the internet so that anyone in the world can access these records. So that's what we've been doing over the last 3 years. I mentioned that we received $342,000 in grant funds. Each institution requested a specific amount to help fund equipment, whatever related to the grant. So for example, here in Montgomery County, I requested $20,900 to help pay for an overhead scanner. So a lot of the records that mention enslaved people are in those, I think we've all seen those really big record books that are really heavy. So those don't fit on a normal scanner, and you really don't want to put them on a normal scanner because when you flip them over to scan them, it can break the spine. So we use the Lantern Project to help fund an overhead scanner. So what's there now in terms of the Lantern Project? So this probably comes as no surprise that there are a wide variety of local legal records that mention enslaved people. And what you see on the screen alludes to that. You'll see things mentioned like bills of sale, probate records, court records, deeds, receipts, and much more. So at least in Alabama, I can only speak from the Alabama perspective, but in Alabama we have what are called probate courts. And probate courts obviously have many different functions in Alabama. That's where you go to get your driver's license, your car tag, get married, adoption, so on and so forth. But probate courts also deal with matters of property. And why that matters for us is because, unfortunately, enslaved people were regarded as property, right? And so Alabama probate courts accordingly have constant mentions of enslaved people and those who participated in the slave trade and slave economy. So that's why on this slide you'll see probate court records mentioned, as well as other court records. Another document type that we need to go ahead and talk about and get out of the way, because a lot of people don't know about this, is what we call estate files. An estate file is when a person dies and their assets have to be divided up among the heirs, their debts need to be settled, and so forth, right? So estate files are a common legal record. They're a foundational legal record, right? You can find them anywhere in the country. Well, in the Southeast, 19th century estate records, which include 1800s, pre-Civil War materials, include mentions of enslaved people because enslaved people are property. So estate files are very, very valuable for trying to locate enslaved people in the local historical record. And they're everywhere in the Southeast. It's not like you have to travel to some special place to find estate records. They're in every Alabama community, and yet people underutilize these records. They're not aware of how valuable estate records can be. A gentleman in our audience here in Montgomery mentioned that he's doing work on a section of Montgomery called the Peacock Tract, and he specifically mentioned not an enslaved man, but a slave owner with the last name Peacock. I bet you that if we went to our estate files, we would find an estate record mentioning this gentleman, right? And so what we're doing with these records is we're digitizing them as we find them, so we're scanning them. We're transcribing them because 19th century cursive is difficult to read, and the younger generation, frankly, cannot read cursive, many of them. And so we're transcribing them, and then, of course, getting them on the Lantern Project database. So what you see on the screen here, this image is an estate page from an estate in Mississippi. And so as we go through this presentation, you'll see many, many representative examples that look just like this. And you'll notice this is pretty difficult to read, isn't it? So that's why transcription is so important to make these records more accessible. Now, I told you some of these slides would be text heavy. I don't expect you to read every single word. Again, I did not write these slides. But we briefly talked about estate files. That's probably one of the most important records in probate court because of the mentions of enslaved people. It's constant in these estate records. And because estate records are so common, there's thousands and thousands and thousands available in each county. And if you want to get a beginning understanding of what slavery looks like in a given community, you need to look at the estate records. Estate records contain all sorts of records, like slave inventories, for example. Though, in these estate files, you'll literally go through estates that list enslaved people in a list with a dollar amount beside their name, and so on and so forth. Let me ask this: has anyone in the audience used wills to do research of enslaved people? You have, sir. So you could speak to the usefulness of wills, I would imagine. Wills are very important for doing this sort of research because, again, enslaved people, unfortunately, are regarded as property. And so wills, like estate files, are a foundational legal record in America. You can find them anywhere and everywhere. So when you're doing this sort of research, particularly in the Southeast, you need to go to, in addition to estate records, the wills as well. So let's see here. Another record that we probably don't talk about enough, but we should, are auction records. So I think we're all aware that slave auctions took place in the Southeast, and many of those records are in your county courthouses, particularly in probate courts. And will contain a lot of information, right, including the buyer, the seller, when the auction took place, where the auction took, so on and so forth. Another thing that I briefly alluded to when we talked about the estate records, and I'll reiterate, is that estate records would also appraise enslaved people, and so you would literally see a dollar amount beside an enslaved person's name. However, in the auction record, just because a person was appraised at a certain record doesn't mean that they would be sold at that price. And so when you're doing this sort of research, you may see a discrepancy. So bear that in mind as you begin to do this sort of research. Okay, so now this is a really good example of, we were talking about estate files, right? And what those look like, and like what slave inventories look like. So this image on the left you'll see is an itemized list of the property of a man in Montgomery named Elijah Baker that passed away. And you'll see, if you look on the screen, you'll notice it gets very detailed, down to the number of cattle that he owned, the number of hogs, the number of beds, the number of tables, and also the enslaved people that he owned. And so if you look on the right side of the screen, you'll notice that this estate file lists enslaved people by name and how much they were appraised at. So you'll see right here, it reads, a Negro man named Elijah, appraised at $700. A man named Harrison, Jack, both appraised at $700. A woman named Nancy, $550. And this is a really good example of what I'm talking about when I mention inventories of enslaved people. These are everywhere in the Southeast. You can find them in every county. It's beyond common, and it's frankly stunning how many researchers are unaware of these records or underutilize them. And so that's one of the records that we emphasized with the Lantern Project, was getting these sort of records digitized and online, because they are so invaluable. In addition to listing the names of enslaved people and how much they were appraised at, estate files that mention enslaved people would also sometimes mention family structure, which, if you've ever done African American genealogy prior to the Civil War, you know that it's very difficult to locate enslaved families in the historical record. So one of the records that can help you with that are estate records, because on those inventories they will often mention slave families. They will list them together, especially a mother and her children. Another thing that inventories of enslaved people will mention also, like I said, would be ages, which is really important. As you track someone through the historical record, having an age helps you identify this person through the historical record. Another thing that these inventories will list are health conditions, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. They will also sometimes mention skills that someone was good at. For example, someone was good at carpentry or blacksmithing or what have you, which also gives you that little extra bit of information to understand this person's life, right? And you can see why these records are so important to get online. So here's a really good example of what I'm talking about, of another slave inventory. So what you'll see here on the left-hand column is a simple listing of the names of the enslaved. This column provides the ages. The far right column lists the appraisal amounts. And then you'll see that there are little details by some of the names. And so this is a really good example of what I'm talking about when it lists medical conditions. So this first individual you'll see is described as fingers cut. I think this says diseased spine. This says not entirely sound. So what you'll see on estate inventory or slave inventories is you'll see little code words like that. Another batch of common code words you'll see are phrases like idiot, idiocy, dumb, subject to fits. And what that's describing in the best way they can, because remember this is the 1800s, is mental health issues. And of course, we're talking the 1800s, so they don't know how to diagnose things like bipolar or schizophrenia or whatever, But what you see with these records is an attempt to begin to identify mental illness as well, mental health conditions. So estate inventories of enslaved people are very, very valuable for a lot of different reasons. So for those of you that don't know, estates often take a long time to settle and close. And so for the purposes of doing African American genealogy and slave research, that's actually helpful because you can go through these estates that take several years to close, and you can track people through the historical record, which is valuable, right? Because we know prior to 1865, it's very difficult to do this sort of research regarding African Americans because of slavery. So I urge you to go to the estate records. These estate records will also show things like, remember I mentioned that estates contain unpaid bills that need to be settled? Well, slave owners would hire doctors, right? And so estate records will contain unpaid doctor's bills that will mention the treatment of enslaved people in terms of medical care, and it'll often list their names, what condition they were being treated for, and so on and so forth. I can't emphasize enough how important going to estate files are, which is why with the Lantern Project we've heavily emphasized digitizing estate files as we've come across ones that contain enslaved people. I know in Montgomery County my contribution to the Lantern Project has heavily emphasized estate files because of these reasons. So we've talked the last several minutes about probate records because at least in Alabama they are so valuable for this type of work. However, there are other court records, right? There are many other courts. There are circuit courts, chancery courts, at least in Alabama, and others. And these records will, these records will frequently contain mentions of enslaved people, like the example on the screen, which is a Mississippi example, but is representative of something you may find in Alabama. I think we have to acknowledge the reality that slavery was big business, and because of that, the courts were often full of lawsuits regarding things that pertain to slavery, like the example on the screen in which someone imported enslaved people into Mississippi, which apparently was in violation of the law at the time that this lawsuit was filed. And so because this is impossible to read because it's 19th century cursive, we've transcribed it for you here. And the portion that we're concerned about reads, "He brought the following Negro slaves into the state, 7 men, 8 women, 3 boys, 1 girl, and 20 children." And so simply just spending an afternoon in court records, you'll find countless examples of stuff like this, which is why with the Lantern Project, we also emphasize digitizing these sort of records as well. So let me pose a question. We all know that enslaved people, in the eyes of the law during this time period, were regarded as property. Did you know that enslaved people in criminal matters could also be regarded as people? Did anyone know that? No one? So Southern law regarded enslaved people as property, right? However, when it came to criminal matters, right, enslaved people could also be regarded as people. So wrap your mind around that for a minute. And the reason I bring that up is because when you're doing this sort of research, and when we were doing this sort of work for the Lantern Project, we were aware that in addition to probate records, because enslaved people were property, other records, including criminal court proceedings, would include enslaved people. And so we also emphasize digitizing that as well and getting that online. Another common record that you'll see, and at least I know in Alabama probate courts, are receipts and bills of sale, and you'll frequently find these in, again, estate files. I cannot emphasize enough how invaluable probate court estate files are for at least getting a glimpse of what slavery looks like in a given community. when you look at the sort of information that's on a bill of sale, you know, it's going to contain the buyer's name, the seller's name, the date of the sale, probably the location, the name of the person being sold. It's beyond invaluable. If you're doing slavery research or African American genealogy before the Civil War, these are the types of records that are going to aid you significantly in your work. So here on the screen is an example, and again, I don't expect you to read this, but I want you to at least see what these records look like. This is an example of a bill of sale from Mississippi. And yeah, it's somewhat difficult to read, but we've transcribed it. So this individual purchased a boy named Gabriel for $360 in 1845. You see the date right here. I know it's kind of hard to read because the screen is smaller, but yeah, William Burnside paid $360 for a boy named Gabriel, about 9 or 10 years old. And I don't know how else to emphasize how common these sorts of records are in local communities. Again, and one thing we haven't talked about today that I want to mention that I don't think is on this presentation is mortgage records. So one of the common features of pre-Civil War finance in the South is person-to-person lending because there are not a lot of banks. And so what people would do is loan money to each other. But what they would do is they would use land and enslave people as collateral. And so that, you know, in other words, if you don't pay your loan, I can take these enslaved people as payment. And those records are in the mortgage books. How common is a mortgage? It's beyond common, right? Well, in the Southeast, in hundreds of courthouses across the region, are these records of peer-to-peer lending that use enslaved people as collateral. So that's another record type that you need to be aware of that I don't think we address in this presentation that I want to bring up. So that kind of covers the records that we've focused on in the Lantern Project. The rest of the slides in the presentation are going to cover the Lantern Project database, and then for those who came in late, I mentioned that once we finish this, I'll pull up the actual Lantern Project database so that you can see a live demonstration. And if you've brought your phone, tablet, or laptop, you can also follow along. I've included in your packets today the Wi-Fi code so that you can jump on the internet if you want to and follow along with your own device. So what you're seeing on the screen is the homepage of the Lantern Project. So at the beginning of the presentation, I mentioned that there were 6 partner institutions, but that Mississippi State University was the project lead because of the resources that they have as a major state university. So Mississippi State University actually designed the Lantern Project website / database that you see on the screen. And so when you go to the database, this is what you will see on the homepage. And unfortunately, we're 25 minutes into the presentation, and I've yet to explain why we named it the Lantern Project, so I apologize for that. The reason we named it the Lantern Project is because we view this project as shedding light on these records and the people contained in them. One of the sayings about the slave trade in America was that folks were sold down the river into darkness. And so that's why we chose the lantern as a symbol for what we're trying to do here, which is to shed light on these human beings that were hidden in the historical record for so long. So when you look at the Lantern Project database here, you'll see the lantern right here. So if you're on the Lantern Project website, you'll see that there's a number of ways that you can search. So on your screen, you'll see the large arrow pointing to search and browse available records. Do you see that right there? Yep, okay. That's one of the key ways you can search. You can also search by institution. Remember, I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation that there are 6 partner institutions. And you'll see here in this About the Lantern Project section links to each individual institution. So you can click on that link and it will take you to the records just for that institution. So for example, you, sir, are interested in Montgomery, you could click on the Montgomery County Archives link right here, and that would take you to the records that we've digitized and uploaded as a result of this project. A little more contextual information on this page, the source of the records, the states covered by the project, which, as we talked about at the beginning of the presentation, include Mississippi and Alabama. In the future, there's the possibility of expanding this work to other southern states, but right now it's just Mississippi and Montgomery County, Alabama. But that doesn't mean that the project couldn't expand in the future. So there's some other ways that you can search as well. So again, we're looking at the Lantern Project database here. On the left-hand side, you'll notice that you could search by authors, which would be like, for example, in the case of an estate file, the deceased person that the estate file is about. You can search by collections, which would be by institution. So for example, again, the Montgomery County Archives would be a collection. You can put in search terms. So a search term, like when you go to Google, for example, for those who are, you would go to Google and you would type in, like say you were looking for, I don't know, just pick something, right? So you could put a search term in this box, right? You could type in Montgomery and it would pull up all the records that have Montgomery listed in them. Another way that you can get at the specific institutional collections, you see where it says browse the Lantern Project collections here. You can also select the institution that you're trying to look at specifically. So for example, you could select the Columbus Lowndes Public Library in Mississippi, and that would pull up all their records. So this is what a sample search would look like. So for example, if you typed in Harrison in the search box, it would pull up every record that mentions a Harrison. So you, sir, were mentioning Peacock earlier. So what you could do, for example, is you could type in Peacock in the search box here, and if there's a record that mentions Peacock, the individual, it would pull it up if it was in the database. So you see, we've done a sample search of Harrison, and it's pulled up 13 different results. Do you see that right there at the top? I know it's kind of small, but, and if Harrison is listed on a record, it will pull it up. So for example, this first record is a bill of sale. Remember we talked about bills of sale just a moment ago. For enslaved individuals named Tom, Harrison, and Nathan. So there's your Harrison, that's why it pulled up this record. And then it tells you who uploaded it, Mississippi State University, and then you can download the record. You'll also notice on the left-hand side there's some other ways that you can refine the search. So for example, we pulled up 13 results when it comes to Harrison. 10 of those results come from Montgomery County. 2 come from Mississippi State University collections, and 1 from the University of Mississippi. So you could click on one of these, right, to refine it even further and just see the Harrison results from a specific institution. All right, so let's pretend we clicked on this document, right? We found the Elisha Baker document from his estate file, which is an inventory. And this is what it would look like. So you get a little thumbnail right there in the corner. It describes the document. It provides a transcription of the key data points, because remember, 19th century cursive can be pretty difficult to read. We'll also include the date of the document and the subjects. Remember just a minute ago I said you could search by subject as well when you're looking for things? So here are some of the subjects that you could search for. So subjects associated with this record would be enslaved persons, slaveholders, slavery, Alabama slavery, so on and so forth. Now, to expand this record from a thumbnail to the full size, there's a couple of things you can do. You'll see on the screen that there's a download option, which is really useful if you're doing research and extensive research and you want to save the records that you're coming across. You can do that by clicking the download button, or you can click on the title of the document and it will expand it to the full size on your computer so that you're actually able to see an expanded version. So future developments. The original grant the length of the grant was 3 years, and we're in our third year. As I understand it, again, as I mentioned, Mississippi State University is the lead institution on this project. And as I understand it, they have plans to continue this project. You know, possibilities include bringing in other states and other institutions. I know that when we were putting together the grant 3 years ago, we reached out to several other institutions across the Southeast that expressed interest but did not ultimately join the project. That could be an avenue going forward that we pursue, is incorporating other southern states so that we can get a more representative body of records that people can use. We'll continue to make everything transcribed. As I showed you, we transcribe the document and make it searchable, because if it's not searchable, it's frankly useless, right? We'll continue to add information like ages, locations, buyers, sellers in the database, and so on and so forth. One of the things that we've also done with this project, so the Lantern Project website is hosted by Mississippi State University, but we've also shared the data that we've accumulated with other projects, because frankly, we want as many eyeballs on this information as possible. So, for example, there is a digital resource called the Digital Library of American Slavery, which is hosted by the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. We've shared our data with them. There's also another project called enslaved.org, which is what you see right here on the right side of your screen. And we've also shared our data with them as well. So essentially the data that we have gathered and created, we've shared it. It's in 3 different places, right? So redundancy matters. In other words, have lots of backups. And that's what we've done. So for those of you that are viewing remotely, which I think is the majority of the audience, you can see my contact information on the screen. Please feel free to contact me about this project. And for those of you that are in the audience, there are packets that I've made available. If you didn't pick up a packet on your way in, please make sure before we conclude today that you grab a packet, because my contact information is at the back of that packet. And please feel free to contact me. And this is obviously just the logos of each participating institution. And I just love stuff like this. And I think it's important to acknowledge our partners, because again, this has been a 3-year project, multi-state project, and we've worked really, really hard on it. So I think it's important to acknowledge those who have put in a lot of time and effort. Did anybody in the in-person audience bring a device that they can use to access the Lantern Project? You did? Okay, so if you see on the screen and in your packet, there's the Wi-Fi information, so you can connect to our network before we get into the live demonstration. Take your time and go ahead and get on the network before we commence. And meanwhile, do we have any questions from the live streams? Okay, no questions. I must be doing a great job or a terrible job. I don't know which. I'm sure you'll let me know. All right, once we get everyone connected to the Wi-Fi, we will do a little hands-on demonstration. And just give us a couple of minutes as we get everyone connected. Oh, let me pull that back up. While we're connecting to the Wi-Fi, does anybody in the in-person audience have questions? Yeah, go ahead, ma'am. Good morning. Oh, I'll show you here in a second once we get everybody connected to the, I'll walk you through it, okay? Are we ready? All right, so here's what we're gonna do. So if you open your web browser, I use Google, as you can see on the screen. I don't know why it is obscured at the top, but type in Lantern Project MSU. And just bear with us as we all get to the correct page. MSU. Yes. Are we all there yet? Okay. So the first result when you search Lantern Project MSU is this link here, which is titled Lantern Project Mississippi State University Research. Click on that. Okay, so this takes you That's correct. Bear with us as we have some technical difficulties. It looks like the county firewall is acting up. We may just have to follow along on the screen. Sorry? Okay, well, we may just have to follow along on the screen, unfortunately. Yeah. Okay, well, while we figure that out, let's go ahead and start exploring just a little bit. So obviously, this is the website that I showed you in the presentation. So let's start by, you can search obviously by your search terms. So let's just try one. Let's just try Montgomery. Okay, so we searched Montgomery, and you see that it brought up 594 different results. So let's just click on one. This is a promissory note from the Samuel Powers estate, so let's click on that. All right, so this looks a lot, obviously, like what I showed you in the presentation, where you have the thumbnail, the creator of the document, which would be Samuel Powers from his estate, the date of the record, which is 1818, a transcription, your subject fields, and so on and so forth. So let's click on download. So when you click download, as you can see on the screen, it gives you the full-size version. And then, of course, if you click on the title of the record, it should pull up the whole record as well. I don't know why it's doing that, but there are multiple ways, obviously, that you can get at the size of the full size of the record. Somebody suggest a search term. Let's play with this a little bit. You, sir, give me a search term. Peacock, all right. Okay, it didn't bring up any search results. So that tells you then that we haven't gotten any records on Peacock into the Lantern Project yet. So that's something we should address, is that although we have thousands of records in the Lantern Project, we don't have everything from everywhere yet. So
how about Morrell? Dave Morrell. Murrell.
like that. Okay, so that didn't bring up anything either. Yet again, that might mean that we just haven't gotten to it. So if you're searching for something in the Lantern Project, and you know that you're, so you, sir, for example, just mentioned 2 names of folks that lived in Montgomery County. Okay. It didn't bring up those names, right? So that tells you then you probably need to contact the Montgomery County Archives and ask them. So just because if you're using the Lantern Project and you don't find a name doesn't mean those records don't exist. It's just that we may not have gotten them into the project yet. So you need to contact that institution and ask them, do you have these records? Let's try another search term. Somebody give me, don't give me a name, give me a subject, like, give me like a place or a date or something. Let's just play with this a little bit. Okay. Okay. Sherman Hills. All right. So that didn't bring anything up either. Yeah, so we need to change that. So let's pick Mississippi State. Let's search for it there, okay? So that didn't pull anything up. But you see how the database works, right? And so you can begin to play with it and find search terms that work for you. And the other thing, I know this seems disheartening that some of the things that you're throwing out we're not pulling up, but that's because there are just so many records that we're working to get in. I'll give you an example. So I don't have the numbers right in front of me, but we know from the 1860 census, for example, that Montgomery County had, I think, over 23,000 enslaved people in the county, and it may have been even higher. So as part of the Lantern Project, I believe that we located 5,000, give or take, 5,500 enslaved people. That sounds like we did a lot of work, right? But when you consider the fact that the county had over 23,000 enslaved people in 1860, 5,000 and some change doesn't really equate to that much, does it? There's just so much volume in terms of the records that are out there in the Southeast pertaining to slavery that we just may not have gotten to it yet. So view the Lantern Project database as a starting point and use it as a tool, but don't use it as the only tool, right? This is a very valuable tool, but you don't just, in your toolbox, you don't just use the hammer, right? You use the screwdriver and the pliers and everything else. So like I was telling you, sir, we didn't pull up Peacock, right? But that doesn't mean that that record doesn't exist. Same thing with Sherman Hill, right? I want you to come away with the understanding that the Lantern Project is a great tool, but like all tools, it's not the one size fits all, right? It's one of many that help you. So I imagine that everyone in here and all those watching probably also use Ancestry, right? So that's what you do, right? You use tools in conjunction with each other, right? You leverage the power of multiple tools. So for example, if I were doing this sort of research, I would probably use Ancestry. I would use the Lantern Project. I would call the Montgomery County Archives. And when you begin to use these tools in conjunction with each other, then you get a lot further in your research. Is that making sense? Questions, comments? We've got plenty of time, so let's talk about it, if there's something to talk about. No questions? No questions. You can ask anything. I mean, you are attending. Go ahead. Yeah. So the question was not related to the Lantern Project, but a good one. I think we've all seen advertised that the data from the 1950 census is now publicly available. I believe, I know that I'm going to get called out for this, but I believe that census data becomes available 70 years after it's taken. I think it's something like that, which is why the 1950 census has now become publicly available. Yes, that should be more than accessible with an Ancestry subscription. However, I am always for saving people money, and Ancestry can get pricey. Most local libraries in your communities have an Ancestry subscription. Your tax dollars pay for the local library. So if you wanted to save some money, you could just drive down to your library and have them show you how to use Ancestry, and you get to use it for free. So that 1950 census data you're talking about, go use the library subscription, and if you don't know how to use it, get them to teach you too. Yes, ma'am. I would just be mindful that because Ancestry is a for-profit company, that at any time, they can change, how they operate. So just because she carried you to that one time doesn't mean that it's always going to be there for free, if it is for free still. So that's why I tell you, just be aware that in any day Ancestry could change its mind on something and put something behind a paywall. And so that's why it's important for everyone attending, both virtually and in person, to know that most local libraries will have an Ancestry subscription. And all you need to do is, some will probably offer it just on their website, but if they don't, you can still just drive down to the library and use it there as well. Ancestry can get pretty expensive pretty quickly, so I just, that's why I tell you about things like the library subscriptions, and also why we do projects like the Lantern Project, because they're free. This is not really the time and place for a discussion about the ethics of paywalls when it comes to research, but I'm of the opinion that the more information we have publicly available for free, the better, which is one of the many reasons I participated in the Lantern Project, that I, as the county archivist of Montgomery, made sure that we were included in this project. Because we are sitting, at least in Montgomery County, on an absolute goldmine of information like this, and we need to find ways to get it out there. And this is one of the ways that we can do that. More questions and comments? Yeah, we can try. I'm not too hopeful, because I remember when doing this project, a lot of the stuff was closer into the city, I believe, but we can certainly play with that and see. Well, not now, so it's not far. Well, it's not far out of the side of the city now, but imagine back then when you're riding horses and wagons out to Hope Hole, it's a little further. You know what I mean? So there you go. There's no results for Hope Hole. So let me tell you how. at least early on in this project, how it's going to be easier to find if you search by, like, say, county name or person's name, so, or a subject term. So if you put in a general term like slavery, obviously you're going to bring up lots and lots of records, right? If you put in a very specific term like Hope Hole, you might get one or two or nothing, right? It just depends what we've put in there. And that's what I'm trying to convey is, you know, we've been at this project for 3 years and we've got thousands of records up, but there's tens of thousands more to go. You wouldn't believe the extent of slavery-related records in the Southeast. You think you would until you see it. And then I could be county archivist for the next 40 years and I might not get everything up there. I mean, the sheer magnitude of slavery and the records that it created is mind-blowing, frankly. Any more questions or comments? So, I think for you, the best thing that we could do is, you know, I showed you how to browse by collections. So, here's a Mississippi collection, Columbus Lowndes. Delta State is a Mississippi one. Historic Natchez, Mississippi State University, University of Mississippi. What I would do in your own time is I would work through each of these collections, right? So for example, let's take, I don't know, let's take Mississippi State University, right? Okay, so you've clicked on that, right? Now you go over here and you said Scott County? Okay. So that didn't pull anything up. But that's how I would do is I would start working through each of those Mississippi collections. There's just so much content out there that we may not have what you're looking for in there yet. But remember, this is an ongoing project. And it could be soon. Does that make sense? I wonder if we can see, I'm curious to see if we can look at how many individual, well, anyway. I wonder if there's a way we could see every record that we put up there. I'm sure there is, but it escapes me how to do that at the moment. So, any more questions or comments? Any more questions, comments? You all ready to go get some coffee and snacks? Is that what's happening? Are you fading on me? Right, okay, so are we done? Are we done? Because I'm here till 5 o'clock, so let me know. We're good? Anybody from the live stream? All right. Well, folks, we are going to end it there. Thank you for attending. Again, my contact information is at the back of your packet, and you can just Google Montgomery County Archives and find me that way as well. So thank you very much.